Okay, we started looking at the four theories of how a state came into being, and of the force theory, the evolution theory, and the divine right theory, and the social contract theory. The social contract theory is the one that we should associate with the United States. Um, in the past, I've had students think it was the force theory because we fought in the Revolutionary War. But the idea is, was our government created by a group of kings or despots or dictators, someone who came in and forced us to do exactly what they want? And that's not the type of government that we have. We created a contract between the people and the government. And the idea of a social contract, and when we start looking specifically at the Declaration of Independence and why we fought for our independence, we can really trace our contract back to the theories of John Locke. And he was what's called a natural rights philosopher. And if you look at the time, 1632 to 1704 is when he lived. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Make sure you get that in your notes. So Thomas Jefferson is reading the theories of John Locke and some other natural rights philosopher, but for the video we're going to focus on John Locke and what his ideas are. And what I've put here is an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." So we're talking about certain truths that we don't need anyone to tell us, that everyone should understand that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator, that we have certain rights that are given by God, and they're unalienable rights. And unalienable means they cannot be taken away. And he goes on to say that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. And so what Thomas Jefferson is saying here is that men create a government, and the government gets their powers from the consent of the governed. And once again, we've talked about that before. The governed, that's us, the people that they represent, the people who put in office. So the power that the government has comes from the people. And then it goes on to say that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, when a government is no longer doing the will of the people, it goes on to say it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and they're talking about government, and to institute a new government. And once again, this comes from the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And what we're going to look at here is some of the things that John Locke actually said. When this Declaration of Independence was finished, there were those who called it pure Locke because almost a lot of it, word for word, comes from John Locke's philosophy. And so a natural philosopher looks on things trying to imagine what it would be like if there were no government. And what they call that is a state of nature with no rules, no regulations. Everyone's living basically in anarchy. We really don't have any examples of this other than if you look at the United Nations. The United Nations is an organization that all the countries or most of the countries in the world belong to. They try and deal, or they do deal with international relations between countries. But for the most part, there is no superior power that acts over all of these governments. The United Nations is the closest thing we have. You have all these countries that belong to the United Nations, but we're still sovereign countries and can do what we want to do. So the United Nations can suggest these things, but basically the world exists in a state of nature because there's nothing over and above all of these sovereign states. Talk for a moment about rights. A right is a claim to have or obtain something or to act in a way that is justified on legal or moral grounds. We talk about our rights all the time, but what the idea of rights has changed throughout history. So before Locke's time, rights were considered special privileges that only certain groups had. These were exclusive rights. If you did not belong to these particular groups, you didn't get them. If you were not in a certain class of people, you didn't have the rights that all these other people had. What John Locke and all these other natural rights philosophers come in and say, no, we're not going to talk about exclusive rights. It doesn't matter what group of people that you are born into. People's opportunities should not be limited by the situation or the group into which you were born. It's not your fault you are born into a certain position. You should not be stuck in that. You should be able to move out of that class and to do the things that you want to do. So what we do is we change from the thought of the class or the group being the most important thing to the individual is the most important social unit. So we're switching from class to more individual rights for everyone. So John Locke talks about life, liberty, and property. And once again, if you go back and look at the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what the natural rights philosopher says is that life, liberty, and property are the essence of humanity. They are what make us human beings, and they are inclusive rights that should belong to everyone. And there's that unalienable term again. These are rights that cannot be taken away. So we're going from exclusive rights, where only a certain class of people, to the natural rights philosopher saying, wait a minute, the individual is the most important and everyone should share in these particular rights. Thomas Jefferson, let me go back just a second, takes property out of there because property is not an unalienable right. It can be taken away. So he changes property to pursuit of happiness because the pursuit of happiness is something that cannot be taken away. A couple other rights that kind of fall under these unalienable rights are civil rights. This is the freedom of conscience, so you can think and say the things that you want to, and the right to privacy, and protecting you from unfair discrimination by the government or others. So there are certain civil rights, and these come from the natural rights. And then political rights, the right to vote or the right to run for office. And once again, civil and political rights serve to protect these natural rights, and we can find all of these in the Constitution. So our social contract, Locke realizes that there would always be people who would try to violate your rights. There's always going to be someone stronger or in an upper class, that sort of thing. So the best way to solve the problem is for each individual to agree with others to create and live under a government and give it the power to make and enforce laws. So what we say is because we know that if we live out there, not everyone is nice. Not everyone is going to follow the, well, we wouldn't have any rules, but not everyone is in it for the community and for the good of the whole. They are going to be looking out for their own best interests. So what we have to do is create this contract, whereas a society, we agree to give up something in exchange for something else. And so when you have a contract, both sides give something. So we give up the right to live in a state of nature. We consent to obey laws. We cannot do anything that we want to do. This understanding that my rights end the moment I start violating your rights. So everyone's rights need to be protected. No one person's rights are more important than the other ones. So we consent to give up taking things we want or killing people or, just committing things that we would now consider a crime. And then everyone receives the security that they can be provided by government. The security of knowing that they are going to be there to protect my rights because you may think you have the right to take something that I own, but I have the right to know that you can't do that. So this contract is created between the people, giving up some of their individual rights to harm other people or to infringe on other people's rights. And then we have the government giving us security and protection of knowing that we are going to have those rights. And so what John Locke says is the purpose of government is to protect our natural rights that the individual cannot effectively secure in a state of nature. If we're all out for our own individual self-interest, someone can be bigger and stronger and be able to take away. So the purpose of government is to secure everyone's rights so that no one has to be afraid to live in this situation. And then this is part of the Declaration of Independence. And he goes on to say that the purpose of government, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.